I recently heard yet another sermon about how in marriage, Christian marriage, that somehow there's something inferior and defective about a woman in Christianity who is married. This is in a church where women are allowed to be preachers, pastors, do everything in the church. But on Father's Day, they had to quote unquote go there and say that there's this one tiny little spot where, because of flesh only, that one spouse leads the other. They carefully danced around that word and tried to make leadership something other than bossing. They went out of their way. This was a guest speaker, someone in the congregation, out of their way to soften the blow of submission and obedience and authority to leadership. But when you pin people down, which I did not bother to do, it was all I could do not to walk out, on what that looks like in practical terms in life, you get a different answer every time you ask, even from the same people. They will tell you that somehow this just means that they set the example, which is, a good definition of leadership. But aren't all Christians supposed to set a good example? I mean, what in the qualities that are typically given in such sermons to fathers, the spiritual, emotional qualities, how are they different from one Christian to another based on the flesh? They're not. They're just not. But the thing is that people, even the most so-called progressive people, will hang on to this one spot, the worst spot, to put a hierarchy. And they'll say, no, it's not a hierarchy. Well, then what do you mean by one person always being the leader of the other only because of their flesh? Okay, this is inconsistent at best. But what I want to do is look at some articles. First of all, let me go over to the text itself, which was used in this Father's Day message. They can extol the virtues of the woman on Mother's Day all they like and admonish the fathers for not being nice, that they should be as Christians, but they will still got to hang on to this one thing. And this is somebody who the speaker had been to Promise Keepers, which, if you go study it, some of their teachings are pretty bad. Now, it may have helped a lot of men who were totally dropping the ball and being tyrants, but still, when you put, as I said in the title, a cardboard crown on somebody and say that this is what God says and it doesn't have to make sense, you're on very shaky ground. Okay, so there's three main questions I want to go over today, and hopefully this won't be too long because I have hours and hours and hours in the UR1 playlist on this topic. The three questions are: one, did the women of the time have any opportunity to be independent or anything but obedient? Number two, then what was there any need for telling women to submit when they already were? Maybe there's something wrong with that understanding of the text. And three, did early manuscripts have the verb in Ephesians 5:22? I will get to that. So there's both historical and linguistic issues here. And what people resort to before I get started is that they will always say that people who try to read something other than male entitlement into the scriptures are simply not respecting the scriptures, and that is an absolute lie. Okay, so first what I have here is three different English translations of the Bible of this passage, Ephesians 5:18 to 33. And then I'm going to look at mine, because I looked at the Greek, I look at the earliest manuscripts. Some people have a problem with that, but the thing about manuscripts, and especially after this much time, the longer you go on copying something, the more likely error is to creep in. The more likely things are to be added or subtracted. Okay, so, and this is no less true of the Bible. Yes, God preserves his word, but if you want to take it to mean every stroke of the pen, then what happened to the Hebrew text, the Paleo-Hebrew that was originally given by God? It was already replaced by the Phoenician square script and before the Babylonian captivity, and then it was pretty much lost completely, which is why the Septuagint Greek translation of the Old Testament was done in the intertestamental period, and that's the one, the Greek translation, with things that weren't quite exactly as they had been in the original Hebrew. That's the version that Jesus and the apostles and the New Testament writers were quoting. So if you want to go strokes of the pen, you already have a problem before you get to the New Testament. Now, let's look at this passage in 3 versions. You can read the other 2. I'm going to read the one on the left just for convenience. We have the NIV, the Holman Christian Standard, and the International Standard Version. And you get the gist of it here. Do not get drunk on wine. This is instructions for Christians in general, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Okay? Good principle. Don't lose control. And then here's ways in which you are led by the Spirit. It's a list in the Greek, if you look at it. It's every one of it says speaking, singing, giving, all these ing words. These are things you do that go back to filled with the Spirit. Okay? All of them say the same thing pretty much. Speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and songs, sing, make music, giving thanks. So you're doing all these things out of mutual submission. That is, if you go back and read the first part of that chapter, it's all about submitting to one another. I should probably have included that. Let me see if I can go back and make that a 1. And see if I still get the same thing. Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus saying, follow God's example, walk in the way of love. But among you, there must not be these bad things. No one deceive you with empty words. You were once darkness, now you're light. Find out what pleases the Lord. Shameful to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible. Be careful how you live. Okay, we're getting to the point here. Be careful how you live. And then he says, don't get drunk. So in all of Paul's writings, really, not just this letter, he's saying that Christians are to defer to each other. That word submit, hupotasso, means to get under somebody to lift them up. It originally literally meant, if I get my words straight, there's several different related words. But one of them means to attach supporting documentation to a case. Like if you had a legal case and it needed supporting evidence, you would attach that evidence. That's what it means to be attached to support something. Okay, it has, and other ranges of meanings of that group of words is to, like I said, get under somebody to lift them up. That's what Jesus was teaching. You know, he's saying that it must not be among you this way of the world where you have top-down rulership. He's saying you get under people and lift them up. That's how it should be among followers of Jesus. Anyway, so all that backdrop of mutual submission, mutual deference to each other, thinking of each other as equal or better to ourselves. And this is how that works out in practical terms. You support each other by speaking, lifting each other up, singing, making music, being grateful, giving thanks. And then this is broken off into a new section, taken out of its context by all 3 of these translations. But, you know, actually the NIV that I use the most does it the worst. Verse 21 is part of the list. Submitting to one another, not some to others, as the very dishonest male supremacists teach, such as the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Very biased, very misogynist. They try to soft pedal it, but this is what it amounts to. They're ignoring the lateral nature of this. It's not hierarchical. It's one to another, not some to others, as some of their teachers have put it. I don't know, remember if it was Wayne Grudem or John Piper, one of those people that are very highly regarded, twist the Bible to their own ends because they want to feed their flesh, which is masculine, male. They have Y chromosomes, therefore God favors them. That's what they teach in essence. And they try to soften the blow, but it doesn't work. Submitting to one another. Submit to one another. Submit to one another, even though they put this in a different section over here. That's very disingenuous. And then look, wives, submit to your husbands. Ooh. As to the Lord. Do you know how badly that's been abused? How many women have suffered and died because men will point to that verse and say, I'm your Lord and Master? I'm going to go read through the whole section, then we'll find out what's wrong with that, even on the part of translators. Going on to verse 23, husband is head of the wife, and this is the one they read on Father's Day in my church. Head of the wife. Oh, it doesn't mean boss, it means leader. What's the difference? As Christ is head of the church, what is Paul saying? We're going to get into that, but I'm just going to read it. His body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of the water through the word, and present her as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or blemish, holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to cleanse, save, purify, love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. No one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for it, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. Paul has taught that many times. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to the wife, and the two will become one flesh. That's a quote of Genesis, end of chapter 1. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife if he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Oh boy, did they mess with that word there. This one's the accurate one. Fear, phobos in the Greek. So what is going on here? I think something's been lost in the translation, and deliberately so. Okay, first of all, let's unpack something here that even in the worst one on the left, which is the NIV, which I use all the time, they're terrible here on the women passages. What's going on here is something called a pericope, which you can think of as bookends of a thought. This is where there's a thought being separated out, not where they put their artificial headings. And think of that word heading. Does that mean boss? Even in English, we have like headings here, or head of a river. That doesn't mean the authority over or the leader of. It means the first thing that happened. It means a description of something they're about to say. Anyway, headings. But look at this bookend. Husbands, love your wives in verse 25. Verse 28, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives. So there's a thought being contained here. Okay, let me click off of there so it doesn't get that in the way. Look at those bookends. Husbands love their wives. Husbands love your wives. What's in between here is an example of how Christ loved the church. An example of love, not an example of how men are lords and masters over women, especially husbands over wives, and not that a man saves his wife as some believe. That's not what Paul is arguing here. He's saying this is an example that husbands should look to what love looks like in action. Jesus is God in the flesh. Husbands are not. So Paul is saying, look at how Christ loved the church. He's God over the church, and look what he did. Look at the Last Supper where he washed their feet. I've gone over that before. Paul is not telling the husbands to be God. Okay, and what about the fear? First of all, what about mystery, Christ in the church? Is Paul saying that somehow a husband is like Christ over his wife? No, he is not. And yeah, chat person, I am angry because I hate when the scriptures are twisted. I'm untwisting them. But let me go on. This passage is badly twisted. And I just explained one of the ways it's twisted. They're saying that a husband is God over his wife. That is not what Paul is teaching here. Okay, he's talking about that a husband must love his wife. Why is he saying that when all Christians are supposed to love each other? Because he just said this. What wives supporting their husbands. There was a law at the time in that century called the marriage without hand. In that law, it was supposed to stop domestic abuse, but it only made it worse. It used to be that that the law had been before that a wife was pretty much owned by her husband, but what the Roman law, marriage without hand, said was she's owned by her father, so that if the husband beat her, he could take the father could take her back and give her to some other man. What Paul is saying here in that backdrop is no. Wives, be loyal to your husbands, your own husbands, not your fathers. How do I know this? Partly because of that law, but also partly because women of that time didn't even have the option of being independent. They were completely socially dependent on a man of some sort, their father or brother or husband. Okay, they were going to starve and be despised if they weren't attached to some man in that culture and time. So if Paul says, no, you can't run back to your father, then he must say to the husbands, love your wives. And this is a good example of Christ loving the church of what that means in practice. What does head mean? We've already seen that the head of a section of text or the head of a river is not the leader over it. Head, kephali in Greek, meant source or originator in society. In the figurative use of that term, head was literal head. The figurative use is the question. And that is, did it ever include in its semantic range the meaning ruler or even leader? No, it did not. Leader only in the sense of the point of an army going out to battle, which was usually the strongest soldier, not the king, not any kind of magistrate or ruler, likely someone who was going to die because they led the battle. They didn't lead it because they were in authority. They led it because they were big and strong. Okay, so this is what head, kephali, meant in the first century. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that head started to include in English the meaning of boss or leader. It didn't mean that. Here's what I see going on in the Greek. This is a list. As I mentioned, we can see that in the Greek if you look at it. Talking, singing, giving thanks, supporting. These are all list items. This is how we're filled in spirit, how we support each other. Paul had just said, supporting each other. Okay? And I already read that beginning part. Supporting each other. That's mutual. That is not top down. Supporting each other. Okay? Verse 22, no verb. No verb. It does not say, break paragraph, wives submit to your husbands. There's no verb there in the Greek. Look again. They're putting a verb in. Wives submit. Where's this verb in the Greek? It's not there. Okay? So, as I have in the footnote here, they all go back to filled in the spirit. The last item is a play on words with kephali and the body and the head. In every instance Paul uses body and head, he says what exactly is in line with the Greek thought at the time, which is that the body grew out of the head, but the head and body were mutually supportive and dependent. The head fed the body, but the body supported the head. The head couldn't do anything without the body, and the body couldn't live without the head. It's mutuality that Paul is using in every time he talks about head and body in the scriptures. And so this is what he's talking about here with husband head with the wife, you know, and especially in 1 Corinthians 3:11. Here again, body he saved. Okay, source is the proper word there in that context, because he's saying the fact that Adam was the first made and Eve was made from Adam. He was the source of her. And you're going back to that passage I've been over many times in 1 Corinthians 11. We'll explain that in more detail. But here he's using his same consistent, if we take Paul consistently, use of kephali as a source of, not a leader of. Okay, and if you want to see the Greek there, let's go look at it. Let's start in 5:21. Go to Ephesians 5:21. Going to be up a little higher than that because that's how it works. Always giving thanks, be supportive of each other. The woman to those own men. That's it. There's no separate word for husbands and wives in Greek in the first century. So no verb. Okay, there's no different verb. This is the same thought. So you can't break verses 21 and 22 apart. Now, let's look at what was actually going on in the first century. I hate it when they put something in front of the screen like that. Let me get rid of that. Jesus was a revolutionary. This is Jews for Jesus, okay? These people are not necessarily, if they were at all brought up in a Talmudic tradition, these people are not trying to push women's rights. So, Jesus challenged the status quo. Take, for example, Jesus' dealings with women. By publicly including women in his ministry, Jesus shattered the prejudicial customs of his day. Why was it unusual for Jesus to speak with women? Nothing in the Mosaic Law prevented men and women from conversing with each other. They're going to go on to say some pretty ignored things here. Yet, because the society of Jesus' day with custom, dictated by rabbinic Judaism, differed strikingly from the Old Testament social order. In other words, by the first century, women's rights had degraded severely. Okay, in earlier times, women participated in every aspect of community life except the temple priesthood, freely engaged in commerce and real estate. Proverbs 31, she was a business leader, did international trade and so forth. Manual labor, not excluded from temple worship, played music in the sanctuary, prayed, sang and danced with men in religious processions, participated in music and festivities at weddings. Women were included when God instituted the Mosaic covenant. You can see that in Deuteronomy 29:11, and were present when Joshua read the Torah to Israel. Presence was not just an option. They were required to be present for public reading of scriptures. Nor were women limited to private roles back then. Several exercised leadership roles over Israel. Miriam led the women of Israel in worship. Deborah was a judge and prophet. Huldah was also a prophet whom King Josiah consulted instead of Jeremiah, her contemporary. So God was not, as I've mentioned before in other videos, scraping the bottom of the barrel. Women were held in high regard in the Old Testament times. God told Abraham to listen to his wife. Proverbs 18:22 tells that who finds a wife finds a good thing. Proverbs 19:14 says an intelligent wife is a gift from God. Wise women found their way into the pages of the Bible. Abigail's wisdom and valor so touched King David that she became his wife, and the wise woman of Tekoa was sent to persuade David to lift the ban on his son Absalom. By New Testament times, women's rights had declined. In theory, women were held in high regard by first century Jewish society, but in practice, this was not always true. The concept of, however you pronounce that, chezuna, or the private role of women, was based on Psalm 45:13. The king's daughter is all glorious within. They had the legalistic surface skim approach to scripture was even being used then, and they made it so that she had to stay in the house. That's how they twisted the scripture. Women were not allowed to testify in court. This is sounding more like Islam today. In effect, this categorized them with the Gentiles, minors, deaf mutes, and undesirables, such as gamblers, the insane, usurers, and pigeon racers, who were also denied that privilege. On the other hand, a king could not bear witness in court, nor could the Messiah, which somewhat lessens the stigma of that restriction, they go on to say there. Customarily, even a woman of stature could not engage in commerce and would rarely be seen outside her home. How different from Proverbs 31. Okay, only if she had no other choice would she go out and try to work to support herself, but it was still pretty shameful. And you can see a quote from the rabbis there in the Talmud. Even respectable women were supposed to stay home. Women with whom Jesus spoke were very likely illiterate, since the rabbis did not consider it incumbent upon women to learn to read in order to study the scriptures. Okay, so they twisted the scriptures and restricted women much more than they had been intended to be by God. Were separated from men in public, could not go beyond the women's court, et cetera, et cetera. You can read the rest of that. And I forgot to give you that link in the chat. I wanted to remember to do that. I'll look at the chat later, but there's that link to this article I'm looking at right now. And what it says, one Talmudic passage perhaps best sums up the situation of women at the time of Christ. They are swathed like a mourner, referring to the face and hair coverings, isolated from people and shut up in prison. This is pretty much the burqa of Islam today. This is what the Talmud was teaching by the time of Christ. Okay, and later solidified into later rabbinical writings. But this was how bad it had gotten for women by the time of Christ and the first century writers. So what brought about the change? The degraded view of women's role was imported from Greek thought. Very likely, the similarities between Hellenistic and Talmudic views of women are remarkable. Though the influence of their heathen neighbors, through the influence, the rabbis slowly relegated women to their first century seclusion. So Jesus was a revolutionary. He undid a lot of that, although the people who followed the first century put it right back in place in violation of his teachings and examples. He offers his teachings freely to anyone who listen, whether they were women or men. We see him directly talking to women on numerous occasions. The woman at the well is perhaps the best known of these. And the disciples were marveled that he was talking to her. In Luke, we see Jesus publicly associating with women, some of high standing, some of ill repute. Then we have the Canaanite woman, a foreign woman, no less. So she was the bottom of the barrel, and Jesus spoke to her eventually. And she is the only woman and the only person in the New Testament who won an argument with Jesus. And then in the Gospels, he offers his teaching and healing to women, and women were showing the most gratitude. They had a lot more to lose by being ignored, and they were used to being ignored. So where does anybody get the idea from these examples that women had to be put back in their place? No, they had to be taken out of it because they were put there in these prisons by men who had twisted the scriptures. Okay. We see also mentioned in the scriptures Anna in the temple, and other women who washed his feet, anointed him for burial, stayed with him at the cross till the end, and were the first to come to the tomb and proclaim the resurrection. These are all women portrayed in the New Testament. And I don't know if they mentioned Mary, the sister of Martha, who was sitting at Jesus' feet to learn his teachings. And this was very scandalous at the time. And I think that's what a lot was going on in Martha's mind, was not so much that she needed help in the kitchen, but that Mary was embarrassing her by acting like a man. And Jesus rebuked Martha, not Mary. So there you have the backdrop of what had gone wrong, the level to which women had sunk at the hand of men by the time of Christ. Now, the thing is, why is that verb missing in Ephesians, and should it be? And here's an article that someone is criticizing another person for saying that that verb isn't there, and saying, this is the criticism, your scholarship is shallow and you're showing a very judgmental attitude toward the translators. It borders on bigotry. I suggest you check your heart before the Lord. Very rebuking and condescending, but we'll go on. Verse 22 does have the word submit, hupotasso, in it. Only two manuscripts, P46 and B, have hupotasso left out. Hupotasso, submit, is in thousands of manuscripts. He gives the list there. Why did the editors of the N.A. Nestle Allen 27 Greek texts leave it out? If there's bias in this issue, it would seem to be the one that wishes to avoid the submission of women to men as taught in this verse. Well, We just saw the backdrop of why that wouldn't be taught by Jesus or any of his close followers. Anyway, I'll go on with the quote. The only major translation that seems to follow the NA 27 at this point is the New American Standard. All the others, and rightfully so, given the manuscript evidence, according to him, follow the vast majority, quantity over quality, I guess, and the critical additions, such as majority text, Stephanus, Schreiber, and renew the verse, wives, to your own husbands, submit as to the Lord. This is where people harp on that, as to the Lord, to make the husband the God of the wife, which is idolatry. But anyway, so her response is, to this person named Tom, suggests that the bias is with the NA 2017. Did they want to avoid the issue of the submission of wives? Tom seemed to suggest that at best the scholars who produced the Greek text of NA 27 had no good reason to leave out submit in Ephesians 5:22, or at worst that they were themselves biased. And this is laughable, because we all know how these same committees tried to change Junia in Romans 16 to a man because they didn't like her being an apostle. So set that aside for now. But she set out to look objectively at the evidence, found several compelling reasons for the omission of the verb submit. I also found that the NA 27 is not the only Greek text that has the term omitted. The Lexham Siri syntactic Greek New Testament, I'm used to reading Sinaitic, UBS 4th edition and NA 28 all leave out the verb in verse 22. There are also countless other scholars and commentaries that note that the earliest manuscripts do not have the verb in verse 22. And then she goes on to look at the evidence. The thing is that earlier in any text transmission is usually better because there's been less time for tampering and mistakes in copying. And that includes the habit of people making, most efficient use of the writing materials they had because they were so expensive. They would put footnotes just about anywhere. And sometimes later copyists didn't know which part was the main text and which were the footnotes. So by erring on the side of caution, they put it in. And so things crept in that were added to the text as time went on. That's why you have to put a lot of weight on the earlier text. She cites, first of all, Jerome, which was actually the first translation that wasn't Greek of the Old Testament and any translation of the New Testament. Born 347 AD, so that was a little while after, but he was the earliest witness saying he knew of no Greek manuscript that had the verb in Ephesians 5:22. And she goes on to cite his reasons for the source for that. What Erasmus, everybody should know that name if they're going to purport to say that this article is wrong or I'm wrong, was saying in Latin was that the scholars added to what the Spirit said, and they added a word in the original Greek to make it easier to read the verse separately without the context. That's what the modern translations have done. They've broken a sentence in midway in order to make a new section and take it out of its context. They did this in their translation. It is very disingenuous. They know what they're doing, and they did it for prejudice reasons. Jerome was best known for translating most of the Bible into Latin. His translation became known as the Vulgate, the vulgar tongue. So there's a long history of putting Bibles into the language of the common people, and that's what modern translations do too, and they all have their prejudices, as we're seeing. If there was no copy of the Greek manuscript available in Erasmus' time that had submit, that is a very important piece of information. There is no valid reason for the removal of submit in verse 22 if it was in the original. These people were all patriarchal. They were all biased in favor of men. They were all men. Why would they deliberately leave that out, especially in those days? 2 manuscripts, but the best Greek text she has here. Tom's response to me says the verb is in thousands of manuscripts in ancient translations. He says that only 2, P46 and B, have submit left out. What Tom does not reveal is that the manuscripts that do not have the addition of submit in verse 22 are among the oldest manuscripts. The ones that don't have it are the older ones. P46 is one of the oldest extant New Testament manuscripts in Greek. It was written on papyrus and has been dated back to between 175 and 225 AD. We have some from like 130 AD fragments of the New Testament, which is what I always throw at people who try to claim that the Jesuits wrote the Bible, and they didn't exist till 1540. So there you go. Only about 40 Greek papyrus copies of the New Testament have survived from that period. P46 is the earliest extant collection. of Paul's letters. A photograph, P46, that includes Ephesians 5:8 through 25 is available online here. You can go check that text. What Tom also does not reveal is that of all the manuscripts that contain submit in Ephesians 5:22, there is no agreement regarding the grammar of the verb or the word order where submit is placed. In other words, if it shows evidence of having been added later because it's inconsistent. Where is it in the sentence? What grammatical part of speech is it? It's on all different forms depending on where the person decided to put it because it wasn't there in the original. Ernest Beth gives a 3-point strong argument for why the absence of any form of the verb is the correct reading. And you can go read through that. They look at the passive form, all the other grammatical issues. Gunakes is here, it's the word for women, wives. No form of the verb is found in B46, blah, blah, blah. You can read all that evidence. And in the scholar's opinion, the absence of any form of the verb is the correct reading. It probably came to be inserted when 5:22-33 was read as a unit in worship. A lectionary reading could hardly begin with a verbless sentence. So they changed it to fit their preferences and ease of reading rather than being accurate. And then she cites another source, Peter O'Brien. The verb just isn't there. Okay, and she gives reasons and reasons and reasons why the verb is not there. Okay, so the correct reading in Ephesians is, as I put it here, if I can find the right link, wives to your own husbands as to the master. The verb is not there. Okay, and again, as I mentioned earlier about the whole context, including all of Paul's writings and the teachings and examples of Jesus, women were already smashed into the ground by society and by especially the religious leaders to have no standing, no rights, no equality. It wasn't even in their mind, but here was Jesus lifting them back up again. And the New Testament writers did the same lifting back up. What did Paul talk about all over the place? Mutual submission, submit to one another. He says it right here in this list. Whoops, I went too far. Being supportive of each other. What's that word? Hupotasso again. There's the range of meanings you can see on the pop-up. Support, uphold, append, or attached or joined. That's what I was talking about with legal representation, that if you had a case to make, you attached supporting documentation. That's how this word was used. Align, such as loyalty, associated, related, loyal, committed, brought under influence. These are all the range of meanings of how this word is used. It is not blind obedience to a master, let alone a lord posing as Christ over his wife. But the main thing is that when people try to soft pedal what they think they see here and say, well, it just means he's leading and guiding. Again, the question is, what is it about his flesh that makes him inherently the leader of someone else with different flesh, female flesh, who apparently by nature lacks something and needs a man to lead her? That is unavoidable no matter what term you use. That's the point. Okay, so we've seen in some of these other things, I don't remember, let's see, I think I put this one in, but I did not put this link. I don't remember putting this link. Let me put this in the chat as well. And you can go to my website anytime you want. You can go to Bible Gateway. You go to my Greek Interlinear. I'll just give you that link. That'll get at the top of the page, and then you'll have to type in the reference you want. But the point is, as I said about a cardboard crown or a figurehead, when people try to say that a husband leads his wife, that's what they're doing. They're making a figurehead and implying that there's something intrinsically defective about the wife that makes her in need of a husband to lead her. In what way? They can't say. And here again, they can't agree, just like adding the verb to Ephesians 5:22 that isn't there. It's all over the map because it doesn't belong there. And it ignores the context, deliberately so, about supporting each other. It's mutual. And what Paul is saying there in Ephesians is because a woman's loyalty is to her husband and not her father anymore, then because of that, the husbands must be absolutely required to love their wives and not be harsh with them, because the women were taking a great risk of domestic abuse in that culture. Okay, there were no women's rights at that time to speak of. They had been destroyed from God's original plans by the rabbis and scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees and society in general who followed them. And Jesus was undoing that. The New Testament writers were undoing that. Paul was undoing that. And I've gone all over his writings. My book, You Are All One, goes through the entire Bible, doing a Bible study on how these things worked, how they went bad, and how they were corrected, and how after the apostles died, they went right back to the sewer again. So when somebody teaches a sermon and says, well, the husband is the leader of the wife, and it says so right here in Ephesians 5, no, that is twisting scripture. So now let me take a look at the chat, because I don't think there's a lot of people here. We got 6 people. Yes, Jesus did die for our sins, buried and rose again. That is the gospel. That's all that really matters. And then, of course, what logically follows from that is that as adopted children, in gratitude for this gift we received, not wage we earn, we will earn wages out of love and gratitude and not obligation to a law from a different priesthood. You can read Hebrews 7 about that. With a change of priesthood comes a change of law. We are under the priesthood of Melchizedek, not the priesthood of Levi or Aaron or Moses laws that go with that. Let's see. You seem to be twisting the scriptures because of some kind of anger. Like I said, I am always angry when the scriptures are twisted. Anybody should be. And Jesus was angry at people, the rabbis and scribes and Pharisees, who were twisting the scriptures back in his day. So, and that's the point about women surviving. They were economically dependent on a man of whatever, husband, father, brother, whatever, uncle, even, like with Esther and Mordecai. Even in that day, they were dependent. And so they were held down as worthless in most respects, because even the rabbis were teaching, when they came to Jesus with that question about divorce and remarriage, Jesus rebuked their flippant attitude and their practice, as the one article showed about a rabbi teaching that a woman could be divorced for burning supper. Jesus is saying, no, you're making her commit adultery if she remarries, and you commit adultery if you remarry, because you're not following Moses. You're following your lust. You're going after you just wanted a different wife and throwing women away. He was rebuking them for that. And he even rebuked Martha gently for being scandalized by Mary, her sister, sitting at Jesus' feet as a rabbinical student. That's why she was sitting at his feet. For a woman to do that, especially a woman alone, was very, very scandalous at the time, if you know anything about the culture. So yeah, that makes me angry. I should be, because it's false and it's twisting the scripture. Let's see. So what I'm arguing here today is the figurehead, the cardboard crown, the Burger King crown, as I've called it elsewhere, where because a woman gets married to a man, then all of a sudden he gets this crown, this figurehead on it, that he's somehow her leader in some undefined, inconsistent way, that he must be her leader. And they'll say, well, it's just spiritual. What about his flesh makes him a more mature, qualified Christian leader? Nothing at all. And the Bible should not be twisted to make it look like it does, like it's God's natural order, and we just have to accept that. Because that's not what God said. The rabbis were twisting his words then, and that the Christian leaders are twisting his words today. So let's see. Twisting the scripture for some feminist agenda is exactly what I'm not doing. I'm undoing the twisting of scripture for some masculinist agenda. Okay? Oh, I'm the reason the scriptures are being destroyed? Well, you can just take a hike, Limitless channel. I limit you. You're gone. I tried to be nice to you in other places, but now I know what a misogynist you are. You can just get out of here. Let's see. There's no room for flesh-based religion in the Bible. That is a false religion. Let's see. They probably Jews for Jesus, maybe, but at least they told the truth about the historical setting. That's why I quoted that. Let's see. I'm not promoting fellowship with Jews for Jesus. I'm citing a historical reference. All right, so if you're breaking fellowship, I'll break fellowship with you. You can go away now too. People who twist my words in my channel aren't going to stick around. People who twist God's words in his word are not going to stick around. So, see y'all later. That's all the point I wanted to make.